Everybody, this is Mr. Peoples here again, and we're going to continue talking about the Civil War today. Specifically, we're going to talk about battles in the East, which are near Washington, D.C. and Virginia area. We have three learning targets today. The first learning target is that I can explain the effect of major events in the Civil War, and specifically, this section we're going to talk about ironclads. And so you should be able to explain the importance of the ironclads and what they were. Our second learning target, I can identify the major battles and winners during the war. We're going to talk about quite a few battles in particular in this section, so you need to know who won that battle and what the name of those battles were. And then finally, I can explain the importance of people from the Civil War. We're going to talk about a whole number of people that you should know why they're important and what their role was in the Civil War. So let's get started here. Remember that you only need to write down what is in blue. What's in blue you write down for your notes and put those down. So whatever is blue, you do. Alright, here we go. Alright, we last talked about the Battle of Fort Sumter, which took place in April of 1861. Well, it took a few months for the armies to train and prepare for an actual battle between armies, and we're going to talk about that first major battle of the Civil War today. And that first major battle was called the Battle of Bull Run, and I'm going to say it's the first Battle of Bull Run because there was a second Battle of Bull Run just a year later in basically the same location. But today we're going to focus on the first Battle of Bull Run. It was the first major battle of the Civil War, and it took place in July of 1861. The Union Army had 35,000 troops, and the Confederate Army had 22,000 troops. The Union Army was led by a man named Irvin McDowell, and the Confederate Army was led by General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the guy from Fort Sumter. Now, the reason this battle is called the Battle of Bull Run is because it takes place near a creek called Bull Run Creek near the city of Manassas, Virginia. And looking at the number of soldiers involved, you would say that the Union had an advantage, 35,000 soldiers compared to 22,000 soldiers for the South. And they did at the start, but as the battle continued, another 10,000 Confederates showed up, making the numbers almost even in this battle. Before I talk any more specifics about the battle, I want to show you on a map where this is located and talk a little bit about how the battle took place. So I'm going to get out of here and I'm going to open this stuff. Oh, that's already open. And I'm going to go here. Alright. So here we have a Google Earth image of the East Coast near where the war took place. And you can see a couple places to notice. First off, the Union capital is right here, the District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C. And that's what that star right there indicates. The Confederate capital is down here in this area, and it's the Confederate capital was named Richmond, Virginia. And so the two capitals are not very far apart. Now, as I zoom in here a little bit closer, here we have Washington, D.C. again. And this river right here is the Potomac River, and it divides the area of the north. So everything on this side of that Potomac River is Union, and everything over here is Confederate. And we're going to focus our attention on this area known as Manassas. Now, the reason Manassas was so important was that the Confederates had control of railroads there in Manassas. There was a crossroads where railroads connected, and the Confederates took control of that location. And the Union wanted to, one, get those Confederates out of there and take control of that railroad junction, but also the Confederates are pretty close to Washington, D.C., and so they wanted to make sure that they gave themselves some space. And so that's why the Union Army is going over to attack the soldiers of the Confederate Army. Now, as we move a little bit closer, now this is directly above where the battlefield, where the battle took place on the battlefield. And there's a couple things I want to point out here on this satellite image. First, I want to point out this line right here kind of follows the border line. That line indicates where Bull Run Creek was located. And Bull Run Creek is what this battle is named after. And we have on one side of Bull Run Creek, we have the Union set up before the battle, and on the other side we have the Confederates. And if things went well for both sides planned to attack on the same day in July. And the Union planned to attack over here, and the Confederates planned to attack over here. So if that worked and both of their plans worked, they actually would have fought in a circle around each other there right around Bull Run Creek. But plans changed, and one of the things that the Union did is they recognized that they might be able to get around the edge of the Confederates. So they took and they faked an attack right here at this bridge, and they sent the most of their troops up over here through some trails to come down and try and attack the Confederates. The Confederates actually figure this out, and they move their soldiers over here to stop the Union right up in this area here. Okay, I'm going to give you some names to these places. We have a hill right here that's called Matthews Hill, and we have a hill right here that's called Henry Hill. This is where the major part of the battle took place during the first battle of Bull Run. The reason they're called that is right here you can see the Matthew House on top of Matthew Hill, and then down here you can see the Henry House located on top of Henry Hill. Those are the last names of the people that lived there, and so that's why they're called that. Now, as the Union came by in the early morning parts of this battle, they attacked Matthew Hill, and a battle took place between the North and the South right here. People from Washington, D.C. got in their carriages, put on their Sunday best clothes, brought champagne, binoculars, so that they could come and watch the Union soldiers attack the Confederate soldiers. They treated it almost like a football game. And they got there, and in the morning they weren't disappointed. They watched the Union actually win part of this battle in the early part of the morning. The Confederates and the Union fought right here on Matthews Hill, and the Union was able to start the Confederates into a retreat. And so in the early part of the battle, things were looking good for the Union. Remember, they had a numbers advantage in the early part. As the Confederates start to retreat, there are more Confederates sitting right here on the edge of this tree line. And these Confederates are led by a man named Thomas Jackson. And Thomas Jackson has a number of troops with cannons sitting here, and they're on top of another hill. So the Union is unaware that they are there. And that as the Confederates are retreating back, Jackson puts his troops here on top of this hill and aims his cannon and his soldiers' weapons at the Union that are coming up. As the Confederates run past Jackson, a Confederate officer turns to his soldiers and says, "There, look at Jackson standing there like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." And so those soldiers that were retreating actually got past Jackson's troops and then turned around and joined them. And this made a very difficult force for the Union to attack. And so the Union attacks up this hill, but is stopped by Thomas Jackson's Stonewall Corps. And for the rest of the war, Thomas Jackson would be known as Stonewall, and his troops would be known as the Stonewall Corps. So the fighting continues on top of this hill called Henry Hill, and as the fighting is going on, Union soldiers try to get cannon right here on top of the hill to try and fight against the Confederates. And those cannon are actually taken by the Confederates, then taken back by the Union, then taken back by the Confederates again. A total of 7 times these cannon are taken, until finally the Confederates control those cannon. And eventually the Union soldiers, as the new reinforcements start arriving into the battlefield, 10,000 more troops arrive, the Union soldiers get scared. And at that point, the Union soldiers start to retreat and run back towards Washington, D.C., which makes the first Battle of Bull Run a Confederate victory. And a big, embarrassing loss for the Union and for President Lincoln. And so the first Battle of Bull Run takes place near Bull Run Creek, near a city called Manassas. Takes place on hill called Henry Hill, and it has the winner of this battle being the Confederate Army. Okay. I'm going to come back to this, go back to our notes so that we can see what we have to finish up here and write down for this, for our learning targets. Okay. Again, we talked about Thomas Stonewall Jackson, we talked about the counterattack, and we talked about the Union retreat. Make sure you get down that second note there that the Confederates won the first battle of Bull Run. I'd like to show you a picture. Here is a picture of Stonewall Jackson, what he looked like, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him later on, but that's a picture of him, and he was the one that led those troops to victory in that particular battle. Okay. Now, after this battle, it takes a few months before the armies decide to actually fight against each other again in the East. And part of that is because Lincoln makes a change in general. He fires Irvin McDowell and places another person in charge. But two, it takes some time for the Union Army to be retrained and to prepare again to fight the Confederates, because there were so many Union soldiers that just basically turned and ran, even though they were being told to stop by their superior officers. They just turned and ran towards the capital. So they needed to be trained better, and George McClellan does that. One of the things that the Confederacy has a disadvantage during this war is the lack of ships. The Union Army tried to blockade the Confederate ports, and it was very successful. So the Confederates needed to figure out a way to break through this blockade, and they actually turned to a new type of warship called an ironclad. And it's kind of a funny name, but back then the way they talked, if they said that you were wearing something, they would say that you were clad in something. So for example, I'm wearing a white shirt today. Back then they might say that Mr. Peoples is clad in white. Well, they created this new type of warship that was clad in iron. It was a ship that was heavily armored with iron. And the Confederates actually captured a Union ship called the Merrimac, and they turned it into an ironclad. They put iron around the sides of it to make it very difficult to sink, and they renamed it the Virginia. And the Union Army was very scared about this. I mean, this changes the way ships are built throughout the rest of history. And the Union Army specifically goes to work trying to make their own ironclad. And they put a man by the name of John Erickson to work designing this new ironclad. And he came up with an ironclad called the Monitor. Now, what was unique about this ship is the ship sat pretty much in the water. There was just a little bit of the ship that stuck out, and that little bit was a gun turret that turned in a full circle. And so it made it very hard for the Confederates to attack this ship. Plus, it allowed the Monitor to move around more freely because of the 360-degree turret. We're going to see a picture of it here in a second. These two ships meet outside of Hampton Roads, Virginia, and they take part in a legendary naval battle, the first battle between ironclad ships. And it lasted for quite some time until finally the Confederate ship, the Virginia, had been beaten up so badly it had to leave the fight, and eventually that ship was destroyed by the Confederates so that the Union wouldn't gain control of it. And so this Battle of the Ironclads becomes a success for the Union, and the ship that won this success was the Monitor. Let's take a look at a diagram of these two ships. This picture here is a picture of the Virginia, and you can see in this diagram, kind of cut away where things are, you can see they've got cannons along the sides, both sides. So in order for this ship to actually fire its cannons at another ship, it had to kind of turn to the side and aim with the side of the ship. And that becomes a disadvantage when you see the Union ship here in a second. But you can see the different cutaway, and if you want to pause this and take a look at it more closely in your video, you certainly can do that. Let's take a look here at the Union ship called the Monitor. Now here's the Monitor, and you can see there wasn't much of it that sat out of the water. except for this gun turret. And there were only 2 cannons on this ship, but those 2 cannons could turn around in a complete circle because that turret could turn around. And so it allowed this ship to fire from any direction as long as they could turn the turret of those cannons in the direction they were aiming. So again, if you want to pause this and take a look at more closely, I got this from a children's book at the Eden Prairie Library. So if you're interested in seeing this book, that's where it's available, and it has these diagrams in it. And then this is some diagrams of some other ironclads used throughout the course of the Civil War. The 4 on the top are ironclads that were used by the North, and the 3 on the bottom were ironclads used by the South. Most of the Navy battles took place on the Mississippi River, not so much in the ocean. And that was just because the Confederates didn't have much of a navy, being that they had to start from scratch. Okay, we're going to pause right here in our section because this next part we're going to actually start a new video for this next part. So if you have any questions, please feel free to go back and jot down those notes, pause, jot down any questions, and we can address them in class the next time that you're there. Thank you very much.